The neighborhood of Willow Ridge was postcard perfect. Neatly trimmed hedges framed quaint homes, and the streets were alive with the soft hum of daily life. It was a place where neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves and shared stories over fences. But not all homes in Willow Ridge were equally welcoming. At the end of Cedar Lane, hidden behind an overgrown yard, stood a small, dilapidated house. Its peeling paint and broken porch swing were a stark contrast to the pristine homes around it. This was where Victor Reed lived, a man whose presence was as unkempt as his property. Just a few houses away, Clara Bennett, a music teacher at the local high school, was finishing her day. Her evenings were usually a mix of grading music theory assignments and practicing piano for the school's upcoming recital. But today, her attention was drawn outside by the sound of raised voices. Peeking through her living room window, Clara spotted a group of neighbors gathered in the street. Their angry murmurs and accusing gestures were directed toward Victor's house. "What's going on now?" Clara muttered, setting aside her papers. Victor had always been a source of curiosity for Clara. She had seen him a few times, always alone, always hurried. He rarely exchanged more than a curt nod when passing by. The neighborhood had labeled him the weirdo years ago, but Clara wasn't one to jump to conclusions. By the time Clara stepped outside, the scene had escalated. Victor stood on his front steps. His tall frame slouched as he faced a barrage of accusations. "You're dumping your trash on my lawn again. Victor!" shouted Mrs. Carter, a woman known for her sharp tongue and meticulous garden. "I've done no such thing," Victor replied, his tone calm but firm. "You're a liar." Another neighbor chimed in. "We all know you don't care about this community." Clara's chest tightened as she watched Victor stand alone against the crowd. His expression didn't betray anger or defensiveness, just a quiet resignation. She felt a surge of indignation on his behalf. "Enough!" Clara called out, stepping forward. Her voice silenced the murmurs as all eyes turned to her. "What proof do you have?" Clara asked, her gaze sweeping over the group. "Unless you can show me evidence. This is nothing more than harassment." Mrs. Carter's mouth opened, then closed. No one had an answer. "Exactly," Clara continued. "Now, I suggest you all go home." Reluctantly, the neighbors began to disperse, though their muttered complaints lingered in the air. Victor watched them leave, his eyes flickering with something that might have been gratitude or suspicion. As the street cleared, Clara approached Victor's porch. "Are you all right?" she asked. Victor shrugged. "I've had worse." Clara hesitated. "Why do they target you like this?" Victor's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "Because it's easier than looking in the mirror." Before Clara could respond, he turned and walked inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, she stood there, staring at the worn wood of his door, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Back in her own home, Clara couldn't focus on her usual routine. Her thoughts kept drifting to Victor, the defeated way he had stood against the crowd, the bitterness in his voice, and the faint glimmer of something deeper in his eyes. She had always believed that music could reveal the hidden layers of a person's soul. What, she wondered, would Victor's song sound like? Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, Clara resolved to visit him the next day, if nothing else. He deserved to know that not everyone in the neighborhood saw him as an outcast. What she didn't know was that her decision to reach out would unravel secrets far more complex and shocking than she could have imagined. The next day, after her last piano student had left, Clara found herself standing at her window, staring down Cedar Lane toward Victor's house. She'd spent the day thinking about the way he had stood on his porch, quietly enduring the neighbors' hostility. It wasn't pity that drove her. It was curiosity and a deep sense of justice. Grabbing her coat, she stepped out into the cool afternoon air. With every step toward Victor's house, she questioned whether this was a good idea. What would she say? What if he didn't answer? When she reached his porch, she took a deep breath and knocked. The sound echoed faintly, followed by silence. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then the door creaked open, and Victor's cautious eyes appeared in the gap. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone more tired than hostile. Clara smiled gently. "I just wanted to check on you. After last night, I thought you might need a friend." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but after a pause, he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Clara stepped into a small, dimly lit living room. The air smelled faintly of paint and wood, and the space was cluttered with canvases, tools, and scattered papers. A half-finished sculpture sat on the coffee table, its intricate details hinting at a skillful hand. "You're an artist," Clara said, glancing around. Victor shrugged. "I used to be." The walls were lined with framed pieces, some landscapes, others abstract. But what caught Clara's attention was a series of portraits. Each depicted the same woman, her features sharp yet elegant, her expression varying from wistful to intense. "Who is she?" Clara asked, pointing to one of the portraits. Victor's jaw tightened, and his gaze darkened. "No one you need to know about," he said curtly. "What do you really want?" Clara. Caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone, Clara hesitated. I wanted to understand you. The neighbors treat you like a villain, but I don't believe in judging people without knowing their story." Victor let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You're either brave or foolish." "Maybe both," Clara said, smiling faintly. For the first time, Victor's expression softened, though only slightly. "Well, if you're looking for some grand revelation, you won't find it here." As the conversation continued, Clara noticed Victor relaxing, his guarded demeanor giving way to something almost conversational. He spoke in clipped sentences, but his words carried weight. He talked about his love for art and how it had once been his entire world. He mentioned his struggles with the pressure to succeed and how the demands of others had driven him into solitude. "I moved here to get away from all that," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Thought I could start fresh, live quietly. But people have a way of finding things to hate." Clara frowned. "Maybe they just don't understand you." Victor met her eyes, and for a moment, she thought he might say something important. But instead, he shrugged. "Maybe." As Clara prepared to leave, Victor surprised her by gesturing toward a violin resting against the wall. Its strings were broken, and its surface was scratched, but its shape was still beautiful. "You're a music teacher, right?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes." "Think you can fix this?" he said, handing her the instrument. Clara examined the violin, running her fingers over its worn surface. "It's seen better days, but I'll do what I can." Victor gave her a faint nod. "Thanks." As she walked home with the violin in hand, Clara couldn't help but feel that Victor's request was more than a simple favor. It was a small gesture of trust, an opening to something deeper. Back at her house, Clara set the violin on her dining table and began cleaning it carefully. As she worked, her mind raced with questions. Who was the woman in the portraits? Why had Victor given up on his art? And why did he seem so resigned to living as an outcast? She thought about the way his voice had softened when he talked about his past, the glimmer of pain and pride in his eyes as he handed her the violin. Beneath his gruff exterior, there was a man who had loved deeply, fought hard, and somewhere along the way, lost something important. Clara resolved to find out what that something was and to help him find it again, if she could. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she thought about the woman in Victor's portraits. There was something haunting about her presence, as though she held the key to understanding Victor's pain. Clara didn't know what she would uncover, but she felt certain that whatever it was, it would change the way she saw him, and perhaps herself. Over the next few days, Clara worked on restoring the violin, carefully cleaning its surface and restringing it. Her thoughts frequently wandered back to Victor. Each time she walked past his house, she noticed the subtle ways the neighborhood continued to ostracize him: glares from passers-by, muttered insults, and even trash left on his lawn. It angered Clara, but it also deepened her determination to understand the man behind the walls. That determination grew stronger when she overheard a conversation between two neighbors while picking up groceries. "I don't know why she's wasting her time with him," one woman said. "Did you hear about his wife?" the other whispered conspiratorially. "She left him years ago. Can't say I blame her." Clara clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to intervene. Instead, she filed the information away, her curiosity about Victor's past burning brighter than ever. That evening, Clara knocked on Victor's door with the restored violin in hand. When he opened it, his eyes flicked to the instrument, and for a moment, his guarded expression softened. "You fixed it," he said, taking the violin from her and running his fingers over the smooth wood. "I told you I would," Clara replied with a small smile. "Why was it broken in the first place?" Victor hesitated, then shrugged. A fit of frustration. It belonged to someone important. Clara tilted her head. "The same person in the portraits?" Victor's face darkened. "You ask too many questions?" "I'm a music teacher. It's my job to be curious," Clara said lightly, trying to ease the tension. "Besides, it seems like you have a story worth telling." Victor sighed, setting the violin down. "Come in," he said reluctantly. "If you really want to know, I'll tell you." Over tea, Victor began to share fragments of his past. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, a talented pianist who had been the center of his world. Together, they had been a creative powerhouse, he, the artist, and she, the musician. Their home had once been filled with music and laughter, a sanctuary for their shared dreams. "But dreams have a way of turning into nightmares," Victor said, his voice bitter. "Eleanor had ambitions I couldn't keep up with. She wanted fame, success, recognition. I just wanted her." "What happened?" Clara asked softly. "She left," Victor replied. "She said I was holding her back. One day, I came home, and she was gone. No note, no explanation. Just gone." Clara's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Victor. That must have been devastating." "It was," he admitted. "But I'm not innocent in all this. I let my own insecurities drive her away. I blamed her for wanting more. And when she left, I blamed myself for not being enough." As Victor spoke, Clara's eyes wandered to a drawer partially open in the corner of the room. Inside, she spotted a stack of envelopes, their edges worn and yellowed with age. "What are those?" she asked, nodding toward the drawer. Victor followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "They're letters," he said curtly. "From Eleanor." Clara's breath caught. "You never opened them?" Victor shook his head. "What's the point? They won't change anything." Clara hesitated, then said gently, "Maybe they won't change the past, but they might help you understand it. Don't you want to know what she had to say?" Victor's eyes darkened. "I don't know if I can handle it." Back at home, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the letters. They were tangible pieces of Victor's history, and she believed they held the key to his healing. But she also understood his fear. What if the letters confirmed his worst suspicions? What if they reopened wounds he had spent years trying to close? Still, Clara felt that she couldn't let Victor bury his past forever. She resolved to encourage him, gently but persistently, to confront the letters and the truths they might contain. The next day, Clara was startled when Victor showed up at her door, holding the violin. "It's yours now," he said, handing it to her. "I don't need it anymore." Clara frowned. "Why would you give this away? It's important to you." Victor avoided her gaze. "It's just a reminder of things I'd rather forget." Clara's frustration boiled over. "Victor, you can't keep running from your past. Whatever happened with Eleanor, it doesn't have to define you." Victor's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. This isn't just about her. It's about everything. The failures, the regrets, the things I've lost. It's easier to let it all go." "Is it really easier?" Clara challenged. "Or is it just lonelier?" For the first time, Victor didn't have a reply. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara holding the violin and the weight of his unspoken pain. As Clara watched Victor retreat into his house, her determination hardened. She didn't know what had driven him to this point, but she was certain of one thing. Victor wasn't beyond saving. The letters, the violin, and the portraits were all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. But as she prepared to dig deeper, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the truths she uncovered might be more devastating than she anticipated. A few days after Victor gave Clara the violin, she attended a neighborhood block party. It was the first one she'd gone to in years, and she quickly realized why. Cliques of neighbors gathered in tight circles, exchanging gossip and casting judgmental glances at anyone who didn't fit their mold. Victor, of course, was a popular topic. "Did you see him the other night?" one man asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Skulking around in that yard again?" "He's always up to something shady," another added. "I don't know why anyone would associate with him." Clara's frustration bubbled over. "Maybe because he's not the villain you've made him out to be," she said, her tone sharper than intended. The group turned to her in surprise. "Clara," one woman said, her voice laced with mock sympathy, "you're a sweet girl, but you don't know him like we do. He's trouble." "Or maybe you just don't know him at all," Clara snapped. "Have any of you ever spoken to him? Tried to understand his story?" The group exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one replied. Clara shook her head and walked away, her resolve to help Victor stronger than ever. The next day, Clara decided to confront Victor. She found him in his front yard, pulling weeds from the overgrown flower beds. He looked up as she approached, his face betraying a mix of surprise and wariness. "I don't know how you put up with them," Clara said, nodding toward the neighborhood. Victor let out a dry laugh. "You get used to it." "Well, I'm not," Clara said firmly. "They don't know you, Victor. They don't know your story. But I do. Or at least, I'm starting to. And I think it's time you stop hiding from it." Victor's expression darkened. "What are you talking about?" "The letters," Clara said. "They're not going to disappear, and neither is the pain you're carrying. But if you face it, if you open them, you might find some peace." Victor's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. What's in those letters could destroy whatever little I have left." "And keeping them buried is destroying you," Clara countered. Victor stared at her for a long moment, his face a storm of emotions. Finally, he turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open behind him. Clara hesitated before following him inside. In the living room, Victor stood by the drawer where the letters were stored. His hands trembled as he pulled them out, the stack heavier in his hands than it looked. He stared at the envelopes as if they were ghosts. "You don't have to do this alone," Clara said softly. Victor nodded, his voice barely audible. "Stay?" Together, they opened the first letter. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, her words a mixture of sorrow and longing. "Victor, I know I hurt you, I know leaving was a mistake, but I didn't know how to come back. I was scared of you, of myself, of what we'd become. Please, forgive me." Victor's breath hitched as he read, his fingers tightening around the paper. "She wanted to come back," he whispered, his voice raw. They opened more letters, each one painting a picture of Eleanor's regret and her attempts to rebuild their relationship. But as the letters progressed, the tone changed. The final letter was brief and devastating. "Victor, I can't do this anymore. I've tried to reach you, but it's clear you don't want me back. I'm leaving for good. I hope you find happiness someday." Victor's face crumpled, and he dropped the letter onto the table. I thought she didn't care," he said, his voice breaking. "But she did, and I pushed her away." Clara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know, Victor. You were both hurting. But now it's too late," he said, his eyes filled with anguish. "She's gone, and I'll never be able to tell her I was sorry." Clara knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't change the past, Victor, but you can honor her memory by living the life she wanted for you. A life where you create, where you connect, where you find joy again." Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Clara said, "and I'll help you." That night, as Clara walked home, she couldn't shake the image of Victor holding the letters, his face etched with both pain and relief. She knew their journey wasn't over, but she felt hopeful for the first time. Victor had faced the truth, and now, maybe, he could begin to heal. But as the weight of Eleanor's final words lingered in her mind, Clara couldn't help but wonder, was there more to the story than even Victor realized? The next morning, Clara found herself back at Victor's door. He opened it with the same cautious expression she had come to recognize, but there was something different this time. Less resistance, more openness. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Clara smiled gently. "I told you. I'm here to help." Victor led her to the living room, where the letters still sat on the coffee table. He stared at them for a long moment before speaking. "Last night, it was the first time I've let myself feel all of it," he admitted. "The guilt, the regret, the love. It's overwhelming." "It's the first step, Victor," Clara said, "and you don't have to take the next ones alone." Over tea, Clara proposed an idea. "What if you started creating again?" she suggested. "Your art was a way to express yourself, to connect with people. Maybe it can help you heal." Victor shook his head. "No one wants to see my work. They've all written me off." "Not everyone," Clara countered. "I believe in you, and I'm sure others will too, if you give them a chance." Victor hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the handle of his mug. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "You start by taking a risk," Clara said. "There's a gallery downtown. They're hosting an open exhibition next month. Submit something. Show them what you can do." Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. But then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, I'll try." In the weeks that followed, Clara became a regular fixture in Victor's life. She helped him clear out his studio, sorting through years of unfinished projects and forgotten sketches. Together, they selected a few pieces to refine for the exhibition, a mix of portraits, abstract works, and one striking sculpture of a rose in bloom. As Victor worked, Clara noticed a change in him. His movements became less hesitant, his gaze more focused. There were still moments of doubt, but they were shorter now, and Clara was always there to encourage him. One evening, as they took a break, Victor turned to Clara and said, "You've done more for me than anyone ever has." "Why?" Clara smiled. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, and because I see the person you are beneath the pain." Victor's eyes softened, and for the first time, he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Victor's nerves were palpable. Clara stayed by his side as they entered the gallery, which was already buzzing with activity. The sight of his work displayed on the walls filled him with both pride and fear. As people began to gather around his pieces, murmurs of admiration filled the room. "This is incredible," one woman said, pointing to a portrait of Eleanor. "The emotion in it, it's so raw." Victor glanced at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. "They see you, Victor, the real you." But the most poignant moment came when a man approached Victor with tears in his eyes. "I know this face," he said, gesturing to the portrait of Eleanor. "She was my piano teacher. She talked about you often. She loved you." Victor's breath hitched, and he blinked back tears. "Thank you," he said quietly. The exhibition was a success. But for Victor, it was more than that. It was a turning point. The experience reminded him that he wasn't defined by his mistakes or his pain. He could create, connect, and move forward. In the weeks that followed, Victor became more active in the neighborhood. He began teaching art classes at the community center. His once quiet house now a hub of creativity and laughter. The neighbors who had once judged him started to see him in a new light, their perceptions shifting as they witnessed his transformation. And through it all, Clara remained by his side, not as a rescuer, but as a partner in his journey. One evening, as they sorted through the last of Eleanor's letters, Clara handed Victor an envelope she had set aside. "I think you should read this one," she said. Victor opened it carefully, his hands trembling. The letter was different from the others, its tone hopeful rather than regretful. "Victor, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to yourself. I always believed you would. You have a gift, and the world deserves to see it. I hope you'll forgive me and yourself for everything we couldn't be. Live fully, Victor. That's all I ever wanted for you. With love, Eleanor." Tears streamed down Victor's face as he finished reading. "She forgave me," he whispered, "even when I couldn't forgive myself." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "And now, it's time for you to do the same." That night, Victor and Clara sat together in his studio, the space filled with the warm glow of lamplight. The violin rested on a nearby table, its strings humming faintly in the breeze. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Victor said. "Hopeful." Clara smiled. "It's a good look on you." As they shared a quiet laugh, the weight of the past seemed to lift, leaving space for something new, something beautiful.